There are places in this world that are not meant to be mapped. The Pine Barrens of the Ash Valley is one of them. The locals call it the throat because once you step off the trail, the trees seem to swallow you whole. They say something lives here, something ancient, something that mimics life. I didn't believe the stories. I believed in GPS coordinates, synthetic gear, and the arrogance of youth. My name is Elias. I was a cartographer. I was obsessed with filling in the blanks on the world's map. Ash Valley was my blank. With me were my three closest friends. Mark, the cynic with the axe, Sarah, the medic with the too bright smile, and Ben, the youngest, the follower. We thought it was just a weekend hike. We stepped into the tree line at 4:14 p.m. The air changed instantly. The warm autumn sunlight was strangled by the interlocking branches. The pines weren't green. They were a bleached, sickly gray, like ash that had forgotten how to burn. The ground was soft, covered in a carpet of what looked like moss, but felt like dry, spongy flesh. Rule number 1. If you hear your name called from the trees, do not answer. If you see your own reflection in the creek, do not look away. Mark scoffed at the rule sheet I'd printed from a forgotten forum. Generic spooky crap, he said, swinging his heavy pack. He didn't understand. A map is only as good as the territory, and the territory here was shifting. The first mile was silent. Too silent. No bird songs. No insectum. Just the sound of our own boots, magnified and multiplied, as if a dozen other people were walking parallel to us just beyond the trees. Then Ben stopped. Guys, listen. We all froze. The multiple footsteps stopped, but something else remained. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the very roots of the ash pines. It wasn't a sound. It was a frequency that made my teeth ache. Sarah looked at me, the smile gone. Elias, my GPS, it's spinning. I checked my analog compass. The needle was vibrating violently, pointing in every direction at once. We were miles deep, the sun was almost gone, and the geography of the woods had just collapsed. The hum grew louder, a deep-throated chant that had no words. And then, from the absolute darkness of a thicket ahead, I saw the first sign of it. Two pairs of eyes, reflecting the dim light, not horizontal, but vertical, stacked on top of each other. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't my voice. It was the voice of the girl I had lost 5 years ago. Elias, you made it. You always were good with maps. I didn't answer. Rule number 1. But the other rule about the reflection. I looked at the black, stagnant water of the creek we were crossing. My reflection was staring up at me. It wasn't my face. It was the face of the creature from the thicket, and it was smiling. The forest exhaled. A cold, damp wind smelling of ancient mold and copper swept through us. It was the first breath of the hollow core. The hum didn't stop. It settled into our bones. By the time the moon rose, a pale, sickly sliver that offered no light, the ash pines had changed. They weren't just trees anymore. They looked like giant, calcified nerves reaching out of the earth, twitching in a wind we couldn't feel. "We need a pitch camp," Sarah whispered. Her voice sounded thin, like paper tearing. "Now, before we lose each other." Mark, usually the bravest, was hacking at a branch with his axe. But the wood didn't splinter. It bled. A thick, translucent sap that smelled like old coins and hospital corridors. He stared at his hands, where the sap had sprayed. It wasn't washing off. It was sinking into his pores. Rule number 2. If the trees start to pulse with your heartbeat, do not check your pulse. If your shadow moves faster than you, close your eyes. We huddled around a small, pathetic fire. The flames weren't orange. They were a flat, ghostly violet. Ben sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the tree line. He hadn't spoken since the creek. "Ben." I reached out. He didn't blink. He just pointed. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw the static. A patch of the forest, about 20 yards away, was flickering like a broken television screen. The trees, the rocks, the very air was glitching. And standing in the middle of that static was a figure. It looked like Mark. It had his jacket, his height, his posture. But the real Mark was sitting right next to me, clutching his axe. Don't look at it," Mark hissed, his voice trembling. The figure in the static tilted its head. Then, with a sound like 1,000 dry leaves crushing at once, it began to speak. It didn't use words. It used recordings. I heard my mother's voice from 10 years ago. I heard Sarah laughing at a joke from dinner 2 hours ago. I heard the sound of my own breath from part 1. The forest was a recorder, and we were the tapes. "I'm going to throw up," Sarah gasped. She stood up, stumbling away from the fire's violet glow. "Sarah, stay in the light." I yelled. She didn't listen. She was looking at her shadow. On the gray trunk of a pine, her shadow was standing up straight, even though she was hunched over. Her shadow was reaching for the static version of Mark. Then the static surged. A wave of gray noise washed over our campsite. The fire hissed and died. In the total darkness, I heard 3 sounds. The sharp crack of Mark's axe hitting something soft. A wet, slurping sound, like a boot being pulled out of deep mud. Ben's voice, but it was coming from everywhere at once. "The hollow is filling up, Elias. The hollow is filling up." When I finally got my flashlight on, Sarah was gone. There was no struggle, no footprints, just her medical kit lying on the ground, the bandages inside having turned into long, gray pine needles. And Mark was staring at his axe. The blade was gone. In its place, a long, jagged piece of bone had grown out of the handle. "She didn't leave," Mark whispered, looking into the darkness where the static had been. "She just integrated." I looked at the GPS. It wasn't spinning anymore. It displayed a single message in flickering green letters. Recalibrating biology to the hollow core, part 3, the bone map. The morning didn't bring light. It brought a thick, gray fog that tasted like old iron. Sarah was still gone, and the forest had closed the gap where she had stood. The ash pines were closer now, their gray needles brushing against the fabric of our tent like thousands of tiny, inquisitive fingers. Mark sat by the cold embers of the violet fire, staring at the bone axe. His skin was turning the same shade as the trees, a dull, sickly silver. He wasn't blinking anymore. "We have to move, Mark," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Ben, get your pack." Ben didn't move. He was staring at his own hands. Between his fingers, thin, pale membranes were starting to grow, like the wings of a moth. "The map is wrong, Elias," he whispered. "The map is itchy." I felt a sudden, searing heat on my left forearm. I pulled back my sleeve, and my heart nearly stopped. Underneath my skin, something was moving. Not a parasite, but the skin itself was shifting, pigment darkening into fine, black lines. It was a map, a perfect topographical layout of the Ash Valley. But it wasn't static. As I watched, a small, red dot representing us pulsed under my flesh. And ahead of the dot, a new path was being etched, the skin cracking and bleeding slightly as the ink moved forward. Rule number 3. If the map starts to bleed, follow the red line. If the line turns black, you are no longer the traveler. You are the destination. "Elias, your arm." Mark groaned, his voice now a grating rasp. He stood up, but his knees buckled. His legs were lengthening, the joints popping with the sound of snapping dry wood. "It's drawing us into the throat." I looked at the map on my arm. A new landmark had appeared. It was labeled the nursery. We began to walk. The forest wasn't letting us go. It was pulling us in like a giant lung, inhaling. The trees were no longer vertical. They were curving over us, forming a rib cage of gray wood. The hum was so loud now that I could feel my organs vibrating in sync with the forest. Suddenly, Sarah's voice rang out. "Help me, please." It came from a cluster of trees to our left. Mark charged forward, swinging his bone axe. But when he broke through the brush, he stopped. There was Sarah, but she wasn't a person anymore. She was grafted into the trunk of a massive ash pine. Her legs had turned into roots, sinking deep into the spongy flesh of the ground. Her arms were branches covered in gray needles. Only her face remained human, staring out from the bark with wide, terrified eyes. "Elias," she sobbed, but her mouth didn't move. The sound came from the wind, whistling through her needle hair. "It's so quiet inside. There's no room for me anymore." The red dot on my arm pulsed violently. The black lines of the map began to spread, crawling up my bicep toward my shoulder. My skin felt like it was being stitched from the inside. "Mark, don't touch her," I screamed. But it was too late. Mark reached out to pull her free, and the moment his silver skin touched the bark, his fingers fused. The sap, that translucent, metallic liquid, rushed up his arm. He didn't scream. He just looked at me, his eyes turning into flat, black pits. "Elias," he said, his voice now perfectly synchronized with the hum of the forest. "The map, it's finished." I looked at my arm. The red had turned black. The hollow core, part 4, the mimicry. The sound of Mark's bones fusing with the tree wasn't a snap. It was a slow, wet creak, like a heavy door opening on rusted hinges. I watched as his silver skin turned into rough, vertical bark. His eyes didn't close. They simply became knots in the wood, staring eternally at the path ahead. "Sarah? Mark?" I whispered, but the only response was the wind whistling through their needle limbs. I turned to Ben. He was standing a few feet away, his back to me. His backpack had merged with his spine, forming a strange, humped shell. When he turned around, my breath hitched. His jaw was gone. In its place, a cluster of pale, twitching roots hung down like a beard, dripping that same metallic sap. "They aren't gone, Elias," Ben said. The voice didn't come from his missing mouth. It came from the air between us, a vibration that felt like it was being generated by the trees themselves. They're just expanded. The forest was hungry for memories. It was empty inside. We are the filling. I looked at the map on my arm. The black lines had reached my neck. I could feel them tightening, pulsing with a rhythm that wasn't mine. My own thoughts were starting to lag, replaced by a vast, cold awareness. I could feel the water moving miles away in the throat. I could feel the decay of a fallen log deep in the valley. Rule number 4. If you start to hear the trees thinking, do not think back. If you recognize a face in the bark, it is already too late to remember their name. "You brought us here, Ben." I gasped, clutching my throat. My skin felt like it was turning into parchment. "You knew." Ben, or the thing wearing Ben's face, tilted its head. "I was the first one to be hollowed out, Elias. Back at the trailhead. I've been the forest's tongue for hours. It needed a cartographer. It needed someone who could give its chaos a shape. It needed your map." The forest began to mimic my panic. The ash pines around me started to shake, their branches whipping back and forth in a frantic, artificial rhythm. The hum surged into a roar. I tried to run, but my boots were heavy. I looked down and saw that my shoelaces had turned into fine, white filaments, anchoring me to the spongy flesh of the ground. "The nursery is waiting, Elias," Ben whispered, his root beard twitching. "You have the final piece of the map. The core is empty. It needs a heart." Suddenly, the gray fog turned a deep, bruised purple. The trees pulled back, revealing a massive, hollowed-out clearing. In the center sat a colossal stump, wide as a house, with a hole in the middle that breathed a rhythmic, foul-smelling mist. The map on my arm began to glow with a sickly, bioluminescent light. The black lines were no longer just skin-deep. They were glowing through my veins. I looked at Ben, but he was already melting. His legs were dissolving into a puddle of silver sap, which flowed toward the central stump like a hungry tide. "Don't fight the expansion," the forest thought into my brain. "Become the terrain." The central stump wasn't dead wood. It was an altar of calcified flesh. As the silver sap from what used to be Ben flowed into the hole, the nursery began to glow. I felt a tugging sensation in my chest. Not a muscle cramp, but my very soul being reeled in like a fish on a line. I stumbled toward the edge of the pit. Looking down, I didn't see dirt or roots. I saw a library of faces, thousands of them, embedded in the inner walls of the giant stump like pearls in an oyster. Some were skeletal, dating back decades. Others were fresh, their skin still holding the warmth of the sun. I saw hikers from the 90s, missing families from the news, and even the local rangers who had come looking for them. They weren't dead. Their eyes were open, flickering with a dim, rhythmic light, synchronized with the hum of the forest. Rule number 5. If you recognize a face in the nursery, do not call out their name. To name them is to join their silence. "Sarah, Mark," I gasped. My voice was becoming a rasp of dry leaves. I saw them. They were being knitted into the wall near the bottom. Their bodies were unraveling into long, fibrous strands of cellulose and nerve endings, weaving into the larger tapestry of the ash pines. They weren't individuals anymore. They were memories being converted into fuel. We needed a navigator, the forest thought, its voice now a thunderous vibration beneath my feet. The others were just mass, but you have the shape of the world in your mind. I felt my knees hit the spongy ground. My legs were no longer responding. The black map on my skin began to detach, the ink rising off my arm like black smoke, hovering over the pit. It wasn't just a map of the forest, it was a map of me. My first kiss, my fear of the dark, the way my mother smelled, all of it was being extracted, translated into the geography of the Ash Valley. A new hill rose in the distance. I felt it happen. It was made from my childhood home. A new creek began to flow. It was made from my tears. Suddenly, a face near the top of the pit moved. It was an old man, his skin as gray as a storm cloud. He looked at me with a spark of ancient, dying lucidity. "Run," he wheezed, his mouth barely a slit in the bark. Before, the transformation reaches the heartwood, but I couldn't run. My feet had already turned into thick, pale taproots, anchoring me to the rim of the nursery. I looked at my hands. My fingers were elongating, sharpening into gray needles. The forest wasn't just killing my friends. It was using us to build a version of a world where nothing ever dies, because nothing is ever truly alive. The pain didn't stop. It just became a different kind of sensation. It was the feeling of a mountain growing. My ribs didn't break. They expanded, curving outward to form a cage of pale, calcified wood. My lungs weren't breathing air anymore. They were inhaling the gray fog, filtering the static of the ash pines. I looked at my arms. They were no longer flesh. They were thick, gnarled branches, heavy and silver. My fingers had become clusters of needles that vibrated whenever the wind blew. I could feel Sarah and Mark, not as people, but as pulses in my root system. They were distant, fading echoes of a conversation I couldn't quite remember. Rule number 6. If the forest starts to use your eyes to see, do not blink. If you see the stars through your own ribs, the transition is complete. I try to think of my home. I try to remember the smell of my kitchen or the sound of city traffic. But the forest was a parasite on my memories. Every time I reached for a human thought, it was rewritten. My mother's face became a cluster of birch leaves. My first car became a rusted, moss-covered rock in the creek. The map is hungry, Elias. The forest thundered through my new wooden skull. The territory must match the map. I felt my heart, the last fleshy thing left in me, begin to harden. It didn't beat. It ticked, like a clock made of bone. With every tick, a new section of the Ash Valley was born. A new ravine opened up where my scars used to be. A new thicket grew where my hair had been. I was no longer a cartographer. I was the landscape. A group of figures appeared at the edge of the clearing. They were hikers, vibrant, colorful, and loud. They were clutching GPS units and laughing. They looked so fragile, so hollow. I wanted to warn them. I tried to scream, run, but all that came out of my throat was the low, vibrating hum that had terrified me only hours ago. To them, I was just a massive, ancient gray tree, standing silent in the middle of a clearing that shouldn't exist. "Look," one of them said, pointing at my trunk. "That tree. It looks almost like a person." I felt a surge of cold sap. I didn't hate them. I felt a deep, rooting need to include them, to fill their hollow centers with the gray ash of the valley, to map them. My branches began to lower, moving with a slow, agonizing creak. The needles on my tips twitched, ready to recalibrate their biology. The last heartbeat didn't fade, it calcified. I felt the final pulse of Elias, the mapmaker, the friend, the man, shatter like a glass bulb in a storm. The ticking of my bone heart stopped, replaced by the eternal, heavy silence of the bedrock. I was no longer standing in the forest. I was the forest. The hikers approached, their voices sounding like the buzzing of insignificant insects against my bark. They touched me, their warm, soft palms pressed against my silver-gray trunk, and I felt their histories instantly. I saw their childhoods, their petty shames, their unmapped futures. They were so beautifully, tragically empty. Rule number 7. If you find the heart of the woods, do not offer it your name. It has already forgotten its own. My branches, once arms, lowered with a sound like grinding stone. The silver sap didn't drip. It flowed with intent, snaking across the spongy ground toward their boots. I didn't need to hunt them. The geography was already rewriting itself to ensure they could never leave. The trail they had followed didn't exist anymore. The mountains they had climbed were now just the curves of my own wooden ribs. "Look at this," one of the hikers whispered, tracing the patterns on my bark. He was touching the map of Elias, but he couldn't read it. To him, it was just the random, jagged growth of an ancient ash pine. He didn't know he was looking at a suicide note written in cellulose. I reached out with my root system, gently entangling Sarah and Mark. Now, nothing more than thick, supportive buttresses at my base. We were a collective now, a monument to the forgotten. The violet fire of the forest flared in my canopy. I let out a low, vibrating hum, the same frequency that had lured me in. To the hikers, it sounded like the wind. To me, it was a dinner bell. One by one, their shadows began to move faster than they did. One by one, their skin began to take on a metallic, silver sheen. I watched them panic. I watched them scream. But their screams were already being recorded, processed, and turned into the whistling of the wind through my needles. They weren't disappearing, they were being archived. As the sun set, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise, I stood at the center of the throat. I was the tallest tree in the valley, a gray titan of bone and memory. I wasn't the monster that lived in the woods. I was the woods. And somewhere, far away at the trailhead, another car was pulling up. Another group of friends was checking their GPS. Another blank space on the map was waiting to be filled. I began to grow a new branch. It had the shape of a hand, and it was beckoning.